Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Answers by Senso, where we demystify everything you need to know about AI. As I do my travels and talk to a lot of enterprises, I notice there's so many questions about this emerging technology. So we've handpicked the best of the best in Silicon Valley to really talk about some of these fundamental concepts. And today I'm very, very excited to introduce Ethan Dixon, applied AI research at Anthropic. Ethan, welcome and thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, Saroop, thanks for having me.
Great. I only imagine like we met at a hackathon in San Francisco, and just like the serendipity in this community is just so amazing. And one conversation leads to the next, and now you're here to talk about evals. And this is a topic that I hear a lot in the enterprise. I hear a lot amongst developers. How do you approach actually building the right evals? What are evals? Even product managers are now digging deep into like how to build AI products and products really rooted in LLMs. And evals is a big topic. So I'm super excited to speak with you today about demystifying evaluations and evals in the enterprise. Why don't you give a little bit of background about yourself and we'll dive in.
Absolutely. Well, again, I appreciate you having me on today. As you mentioned, evals are certainly a hot topic in the industry right now. I should give a little bit of background on myself. I'm on the applied AI team here at Anthropic. What we say about applied AI is we kind of live between sales, product, and research. So most of our time is actually spent hands-on with customers, talking about things like evals, talking about agents, talking about setting up guardrails, thinking about patterns for scale, and all the other kind of like weird quirks that come up when working with language models. The other part of our time is spent sort of batching on internal products and thinking about how we do evals at Anthropic. So long story short, it's an area that we spend much time talking about. A lot of people in the space nowadays are thinking about, concepts like eval-driven development, which is sort of the natural follow-on to what we were, used to in the traditional SDLC, which is like test-driven development. So evals take many shapes and form. I think at the simplest version, an eval is a test. It's a question of like, how well does your product request agent work in some context? And we can go a lot deeper about what that means and what kinds of tests people set up and what works and the different levels of evals. But at the very simplest, it is a test. You're trying to answer some question about how your model performs given a context.
Amazing. I'm like using Claude pretty much every day, and I'm asking Claude questions. I'm using it to write code. Most of our audience is probably using some sort of like, LLM based product on a daily basis. And
Yeah.
they're typing in and they're looking to get their questions answered. A lot of the time the question is answered, but sometimes it's not. Talk a little bit about why we need evals and how you look at behind the scenes, like as an eval to ensure that, the responses ultimately get better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it goes back to the fundamental question about like, how do LLMs work, right? They take text in, they spit out text. And the thing that is kind of important to think about in the mental shift is like LLMs are not deterministic machines. You can go one day with the exact same question and you can repeat this question 10 times and you may get 10 different answers. So an eval is really how you set up the framework to kind of try and understand if I want a model to respond a certain way when I give it a certain question, do I know that within some reasonable bounds, it is answering in the way that I expect, right? And again, this looks different based on the context, but you could have evals for things like truthfulness, for things like the types of answers, for things like the shape or structure of an answer. You can do them for completeness. There are many different dimensions that you can start thinking about evals in.
Got it. And like just a question that I always have, especially on the research side, is when you I mean like the volume of question answers you must see on a daily basis is just so immense. When you have that much data and that much interactions, how granular can you get in really improving outcomes in a real-time fashion? Or do you have to wait till like the models are completely pre-trained again? Or is there some sort of inference time improvements that you can make? Curious to know how granular you can get with the right feedback.
Yeah, I think that you could certainly go to any degree of granularity that makes sense for your product. I would say there is the other dimension to think about here is sort of the cost of that evaluation, right? So if you have, we spend a lot of our time talking to customers who are building agents in various domains, and you may expose some ability to an agent, which is, the ability to take action on behalf of a user. Right. We're pretty familiar with the like chat interfaces like Claude AI or ChatGPT, but we're quickly moving to a world where these types of technologies can go and, do things on your behalf. They can order food, they can check your bank statements, they can go and pull information from the web. As you think about like the different abilities of these systems, there are certain areas where you might want to have like a little bit more control or like a little bit more visibility into what the model is doing on your behalf. So in terms of your question around granularity, you can certainly go to n degrees of depth there, but you want to think about the balance of like what does it actually cost? Because often what people are doing in practice is using another LLM to actually evaluate whether or not an action was invoked correctly, or whether or not something was truthful, or whether or not something was comprehensive. And you can certainly do that on every request, right? But often it's not economically feasible to go and run a subsequent request for every individual LLM request.
Got it. So if I'm a product manager in an enterprise, and we work with a lot of regulated enterprises like, banks and insurance companies, and there's certain use cases where, there's just minimal room for error, right? So like, customer support is one of the more intuitive ones that we see more common. And there's certain types of calls where you just cannot mess up, right? Like especially the calls. If you want to launch, like, for example, a voice agent or a chat agent to handle disputes, that's one of those things where that's like kind of the last straw for a customer, right? Like you need to resolve that, and you need to resolve that exceptionally well. So maybe you can give us an example of the types of use cases where evals are exceptionally good at. And I always go to these like use cases where it's, you just have to have some sort of observability.
Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there with respect to like regulated environments. This is really where, as you think about designing products for these spaces, you just have to have really good observability and metrics about what's going on here. And often the crux of these questions is because we have systems that can, interact in ways that are sort of comparable to humans, right? You can get text in and text out. You can feel like you're chatting with this entity. They can often do things that like require nuanced evaluation. So for example, in like a regulated financial context, you might want to make sure that your model is not providing financial guidance. And the definition of what exactly is financial guidance can, be really dependent on the actual interaction, or, certainly subject to disagreement in some cases. So spending a lot of time upfront thinking about, one, what are the failure modes of your product? Two, where do you have sort of like highest sensitivity and like highest need for low level granularity and low level observability? And lastly, just thinking about how you set up a pipeline to do that, right? It may not be feasible to sample every single request, but is there a way to have, maybe some upfront triaging with smaller cheat models, and then having a more robust evaluation pipeline for edge cases? So these are the kinds of like mental processes that we generally recommend customers think through as they're trying to set up evals.
Got it. Usually in like a regulated enterprises, most of the, rules and regulations and like are very, very clear in compliance documents. And, that's an evolving landscape. As time goes on, there's more rules and regulations that you need to abide by. And one of those areas is like any sort of communication with a customer in your call center or your marketing channel. You have to kind of like ensure that it abides by, compliance and regulation. And so like, how would you even think about designing like an eval? Like, and I just want to try to get tangible here. What goes into, what's the first step in terms of actually pulling out the drawing board and whiteboarding the framework on how to develop a proper evals? That would be really, really helpful. What is that, like the number one thing you do?
Yeah. So for this answer, I'm going to assume that we've sort of done all the like lower level stuff, which is like, do we have like programmatic tests around all of our like LLM invocations, such that we know that they work pretty well. We know that like the shape of the response is, or we're pretty like confident in the like return object that we're getting from our providers. The thing that we generally recommend doing is you actually have to like do a bit of like, human problem engineering. You have to go and understand like what is the process that we as people who are subject to regulators, or we who are trying to deliver like a reliable product experience, what are the things that we care about? And often, this is really a process of sitting down and trying to codify like what are the mental models and the frameworks that we think about as we try to evaluate what this product does and how it sounds and what it reports to do, or what grounding information it takes a look at. So it's really about sort of understanding first the human process, and then thinking about how you go and then translate that into a codified, scalable, often LLM based process.
Got it. So an example could be, the outcomes we want in a customer service app interaction, like disputes, is we want to ensure that the customer's needs are met at a moment where they're probably not the most, positive.
Yeah.
And want to kind of improve their sentiment and ensure that they're resolved and they retain as a customer, right? That would be more on the outcome side. But like, from an agent perspective, and we'll get into agents in a second, but from an agent perspective, you want to ensure that the agent is communicating in a way where there's awareness of what all the compliance and regulatory rules are in almost a real-time fashion. So they're communicating everything in the right way to not step over that line, right? So what does a set of evals look like where on one side, you're trying to get an outcome, but on the other side, you're trying to kind of like meet compliance rules and there's trade-offs in the middle. So like, I'm sure that the evals would need to account for some of these trade-offs.
Yeah, totally. I think the first thing to think through is like, again, as you understand, like if you are subject to compliance, you have to kind of figure out where's the dividing line around stuff that I need to run in real time. And often there is a set of tests that you actually want to run, before the customer service agent executes some action or before it reports about some piece of data. Those are the kinds of things where you actually do need some kind of online evaluation, right? And often what this looks like in practice is you will have, again, some chat history up to a point in time, and some part of your program, some part of your like actual product setup, usually flags that, hey, we need to actually go and run this part of the evaluation. So you would go and take the messages up to that point in time, send it off to often a smaller, faster LLM, and say, hey, do we have reasonable certainty that this violates X, Y, or Z regulatory code? And then you would usually get some answer back. There are going to often be cases where you want to escalate that to a human operator and have someone who is in the loop ready to actually triage this actively with an additional lens. But generally, that's the kind of thing. And again, if there are things that are not on the not on that side of the line of needs to be done in real time, then there are a set of like offline evaluations that you would do to assess maybe like the overall quality, tone, expected trajectory, expected number of tool calls, and you could go into again many other dimensions of like how you would evaluate the interaction between a human and a customer service agent.
So if you have like let's say a voice agent deployed in the call center, right? You have a voice agent that, let's say, accepts 50% of the calls and 50% of those types of dispute calls are routed to them, and the other 50% are to a human, right? And so you want to kind of assess like, which one is performing best at any given time. And the prompt that the agent, the AI agent is given and contains a few warnings, right? Like don't do this and don't do this. Is like the eval almost like, are they following those warnings? And if not, like what are they straying away from? And then is the failure routed to an actual like human representative to take over the call? So just want to get a little bit more granular there so we can focus on something like a little more tangible in a real world setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, some of this stuff is like generally very latency sensitive, so you may have to do it, post hoc. But it's essentially exactly that, right? You have the LLM agent is given a set of rules, and it's often a set of guidelines that are specific to your company or like a regulatory body. It is the instructions that you expect the agent to follow on every turn of the interaction. What we see happen often is when you have very long-running interactions, this is kind of a known failure mode across basically all model families and all model providers. It's just this thing of like, there's this concept of context rot. So as you saturate a context window, and what that means is you basically have many tokens that are like available in context over some interaction. Models sometimes have degraded performance and degraded adherence to the rules that you set up. So what this means is it's really important to have these kinds of tests where you have basically a separate LLM request that takes a look at the ongoing transcript and says, hey, do we think this is actually like following the rule set that we've set up for our customer service agent?
Got it. So you have the agent in the field, and then you mentioned before you have an evaluator agent that retroactively observes the interaction and sort of says, hey, did it adhere to X, Y, and Z? And then a set of metrics comes out. Is that sort of in the ballpark? Maybe you can talk a little bit about those metrics.
Yeah, exactly. Often what you would have that evaluating step do is sort of like output a binary like yes, no, or sometimes it's going to be a graded output, like low risk, medium risk, high risk. So there are different ways of sort of outputting those individual metrics. And then what you would usually do is sort of like aggregate those and then look at, for the last 1 hour or 6 hours, like what was our overall incidence rate of potentially non-adherent to policy interactions, for example.
Got it. Got it. Great. So, like I'm very fascinated by this concept of like really measuring over time how like agents are improving and
Hmm.
constantly, I guess, version controlling prompts and
Yeah.
testing prompts. Because what the evals effectively tell you is what about the current version of the what goes into the context window is not like optimal, right? So what we want to do is just kind of like test it. Is that kind of the approach you take? If you're a PM kind of wanting to kind of like
Yeah.
really ensure that you have some sort of control on improving outcomes, is that A/B testing approach common? Is it version controlling prompts? Is that typical in a setting that, for example, deploying an agent for a dispute call?
Yeah, absolutely. The ideal state here is that you are a product manager, and every time you want to make an update to a prompt, you have a complete set of eval results for your before and after, right? And ideally, this is many different dimensions. This is like policy adherence, this is tone adherence, this is like adherence to the ground truth that you've given the agent. It's like resolution rates, all of these different dimensions. And the ideal state is you have like enough test data and enough coverage on those evals so that every time you want to make an update to whether your system prompt, whether it be your system prompt or your like toolkit or some tool descriptions, you have like a complete readout of that before and after. So yeah, the ideal of version controlling prompts is something that we are pushing all AI product teams towards. Usually there's like a little bit of messiness in the middle, but that is the ideal state that we're all driving towards.
For sure. You have a cycle of transparency with every
Mm-hmm.
interaction. You kind of understand that it's getting better. And based on what you said, like even you guys are still internally pushing like all teams to do this. And I mean, like you guys are at the forefront. When you look at like an enterprise or even like the most savvy, growth companies in Silicon Valley, do you see
Yeah.
adopting, evals in their workflows? Do you see that being a metric that is tracked, or is it still in the stage where, it's like people are still getting familiar with that concept?
Yeah. I think there's certainly a spectrum here. So we have some really good examples on both ends of that. I would say we have some really sophisticated customers. I would say like specifically in like the legal, finance, some of these like more regulated industries where they have a system that looks a little bit closer to that ideal state that I just outlined. They have a bunch of evals. It covers many different dimensions, and every time they make a prompt change, they can go and run that eval set, and get a pretty clear idea of like how well those updates perform. On the other end of that, we have a number of like really fast, high growth companies that have not invested as much in their eval infrastructure. Often this happens in cases where you have a fairly like open-ended agent working in like a complex environment, but it can go and do many different things. And it's just sort of like too expansive to actually evaluate on any like well-contained test set how this agent performs. And even some of our own products, like we have like we have evals sort of defined around regressions, but we often like have to just spend a lot of time playing with the tools, playing with the models to figure out like where they work well, where they break. So I would say it's a combination of both. It's often dependent on the kind of like industry you're operating in.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, based on what we're talking about, if you kind of have a choice in like, especially in an environment where there's no failure, and you had a choice between evals versus no evals, I'm trying to really get to the bottom of why would you ever choose not having evals? Because, in context, there's been a lot of chatter here in the Valley of like, evals being dead. And like, just in context of, why wouldn't you do evals? Like, talk a little bit about the sentiment of evals and like,
Yeah,
why it's so important to make that an essential part of your framework.
absolutely. Well, we definitely hear the like sort of comical refrains that like evals are dead or RAG is dead, right? It's often sort of a little bit hyperbolic, pulled from Twitter, but we do think that there is absolutely a place for evals. This is a space where I think because we have so much like net new ability with what these LLMs can do and how they perform, we as like a collective space spent a lot of time building cool things, and like that's kind of where we're at right now. And I think evals is the piece that is like extremely necessary for us to get to products at scale, but we are definitely catching up a little bit on that eval infrastructure side. But again, like if you are in one of these regulated industries, if you want to have like a little bit more confidence in the products you're deploying, you absolutely do need to be investing in evals and like trying to understand what kinds of questions do you as a team building an AI product care about? What do your customers care about? What does your organization care about? What is, from a legal perspective, what do you care about? So yeah, this is infrastructure that is catching up, but clearly vital to what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, you're 100% right. What I notice in every organization I go to, there's a lot of pressure from the executive team, the CEO, driven by mostly FOMO because of, what the industry and their peers are doing and what's kind of what you guys are producing out of the lab, that we just need to roll these things out as quickly as possible. And
Yeah.
you can see, like, for an organization that hasn't done it yet, that's always the priority. Let's just get it out there. And then over time, they quickly realize that these things they fail from time to time, right? And that's when kind of like, we need some sort of observability. We need eval. And that's when the aha moment comes for a lot of organization. But you're right, it is usually a step two in like the whole process of learning. So when people that I speak with across our customer base and across our prospect base, they're usually coming in at a stage where it's like, okay, we need some sort of observability. And one of the questions I always get is like the intermixing of an eval versus a benchmark, because a lot of people see benchmarks published when models are released, and new versions of the model publish benchmarks all the time. And one thing that I see, there's like usually a blurred line between is a benchmark versus an eval. So maybe like educate like the audience on the difference between a benchmark and an eval.
Yeah, this is a great question. We here at Anthropic obviously spend a lot of time thinking about both. With every new model release, you often will see, what is our latest Sweet Bench score or Tau Bench score. I think these are really interesting. These are like good so that we can get a kind of like normalized view of like how Model A compares to Model B. Often like these, we talk about really distinguishing what is like a benchmark and an eval, because like benchmarks are great for understanding, hey, this model out of the box, if we spent no time thinking about the like prompting and setup here, this is how it performs. Again, this is good when you're comparing like models across providers or even between like model families. Evals is really like a product effort. And, we talk a lot about sort of making this point clearly, like evals are a thing that you do when you're building products. This is where you are like setting up infrastructure so that you can understand how changes impact your product. And ultimately, like how can you actually like hill climb on the evals that you care about. So yeah, we really want to disambiguate like benchmarks are for understanding models out of the box. Product evals are for how you think about like building reliable AI experiences for end users.
Got it. A lot of people that are listening to this podcast are effectively just, they haven't started their journey of, deploying agents in their enterprise. So, even before evals, like, and you guys talk to thousands of customers, and, many organizations are using Anthropic and Claude and your models, developers and business users. Usually, like, if you're sitting in the shoes of an organization that hasn't implemented anything yet, they haven't deployed their first agent in the wild within their workflows or in front of their customers, what is that first thing they do when they talk to someone at Anthropic? What is that number one thing that you tell them to do as a first step that kind of intuitively gets them in the flow of, oh, I get it, and actually execution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we see in practice nowadays is that, it's no secret that like LLMs are pretty cool and pretty capable general machines, right? So often what you will find in some of these larger organizations, especially, is that they're people on the front line. They're like developers, product managers, customer service people. They are already using these tools often. And, this is kind of just like a natural function of like people trying to be productive at work. So what generally happens is that we will come in and it's a conversation about like, hey, we're trying to take essentially what our people are already doing on the front lines and how do we codify that and sort of like adopt it officially, and then sort of set up all of the like right data management and observability tools that go along with that to do enterprise deployments. But yeah, generally, like I think the secret is kind of out. People like understand what these tools are for. It's just a matter of like recognizing that and recognizing that these types of technologies are probably going to have a place in business for the foreseeable future. So figuring out how to do that like safely, ethically, in a way that is reproducible, in a way that you have visibility over.
Got it. Yeah, and usually the first step is just in a very, like, this is what I see in the first step. Let's select a use case that, is not high risk. It
Yeah.
may not be the highest reward use case, right? Like, so if you have a 2x2, the top right is always where you want to be, right? Like,
Yeah.
like highest reward, bang for your buck, but like lowest risk. And a lot of the times those use cases are like holy grail. I hope we find one of those.
Yeah.
But like usually what I see is it's usually low risk use cases to just learn, how these agents interact in the field and how to approach building one. Because I think the first one you go after is always the hardest because you're trying to like, there's no formal material out there. And you guys publish great stuff, but I just noticed that there's a lot of missing information out there from an education standpoint, right? So really
Sure.
that too, is that usually the approach where it's like low risk use cases that are very quick to kind of learn? Or are you kind of seeing enterprises jump into the highest reward, like even though it's a longer cycle?
Yeah, I think we often see that like people will sort of do both in parallel, right? Like there are often clear low-hanging fruit use cases that you can get off the ground relatively easily, and then we are seeing more so than ever, even large sort of like legacy enterprises thinking about, hey, how does our fundamental underlying business model change if we have LLMs and agents that are like highly capable and operating all over our organization? So we're certainly seeing that shift, but often this happens in parallel. And I guess, Saroop, I'm curious from your perspective, what have you guys seen maybe in the last like 6 months in terms of like a change in attitudes towards adopting this technology?
Yep, that's a great question. I mean, like if you look back to 2023, 2024, that year, it was a lot about just co-pilots and RAG
Hmm.
systems to enable people to access information in a much more seamless way. And there's a tremendous amount of value in terms of being able to kind of go from having to kind of like go through like, your SharePoint or your Google Drive and kind of like search for information to kind of rapid search, right? And then, but the 2024 to 2025 transition was more about the realization that, wow, it doesn't necessarily need to be a system that a human searches. It could be a system that, we can run ambient in the background and leverage data to actually inform this particular agent on like how to perform better. And evals are a big, topic there because you want some sort of observability. Now I see it going to at least organizations that are rolling this out, getting more ambitious and starting to think about multi-agent interactions and A/B testing and doing various things around using evals to really systemize the process of improvement and, reallocating human resources towards higher function tasks. So a lot of people at the beginning in 2023, especially after like the launch of ChatGPT, right? Like a lot of people really kind of dug into, again, co-pilots and what's this going to mean for our like careers and jobs versus now the sentiment is more, wow, I'm going to like, my staff is going to be much more productive. They're going to be elevated. I still need all those people. Sure, there's some people that are really efficiency focused and are saying, hey, let's not reallocate. Let's like actually be more efficient from a cash perspective. But that's kind of what I'm seeing today. And I'd love to get your perspective. Are you seeing the same thing? Is it even going to a next stage now?
Yeah, I think we are certainly seeing like people have now internalized the impact of this technology a little bit more. As I mentioned previously, like some of these legacy industries are coming to us with like really ambitious ideas about what their product services look like. I mean, you can imagine like essentially all of the websites, the tools, the services that like I interact with today are going to be and already are in most cases augmented by LLMs. I think we extend this trend a little bit further, and we empower like more capable agents. Like I think of Claude Code is a great example. Most people at this point have spent some time playing with Claude Code. It is a very different user experience than some of the other like in IDE experiences, right? It is more autonomous. It is more a function of like a human observing and sort of like orchestrating this tool to go operate on its behalf rather than me being like much closer to the underlying implementation.
Got it. A few more questions. So let's talk a little bit about context. So an agent is only as good as what goes into the context window. And we talked a little bit about being able to control like how the agent gets better through very well-defined, measured evals. So when you think about context, you're only as good as the data that's in your enterprise. And knowledge is usually very scattered in the enterprise. And I think that like what I've seen is that being default state. So how do you guys work with organizations to ensure that context is more flexibly available, is standardized, Because a lot of people talk about content, your documents and all that, but then there's context. What's the difference between content and context, and the importance of having a centralized and unified context engine in your enterprise that almost fuels your agents and like
Yeah,
allows you to kind of really use evals to improve that cycle?
sure. So a couple of different threads here. I just want to make sure that we, level set for the audience. Like LLMs have finite context windows. So what this means is there is a ceiling to how many tokens or how much text you can actually give to these models. As I mentioned earlier, there's this concept of context rot. So as you give the models more of that context, more of those tokens, often you see this like performance degradation. So when we think about like context, and context engineering has kind of been the term of the last few months, we really think about it as like this finite resource that you have to manage, and then also give the model, an intelligent model, like good strategies to self-manage. What this means in practice, and again, I go back to the Claude Code example. Claude Code is a really interesting sort of canonical example of an agent that has all of the sort of abilities built into it, but not actually like overloading that context up front. We obviously have spent a lot of time on our system prompts and tool definitions, but what Claude Code does is it actually goes and like does it sort of like progressively building a context model or the context window on its own. And so when we think about like how you set up information in an organization to be sort of like well traversed or like well understood by a language model, it's often about augmenting the content, which is like, the raw underlying text or the raw underlying data that you're operating on, and augmenting that with some kind of metadata so that the LLM understands how to actually navigate that. So you can imagine if you have, it's like some sort of internal file system, and you need an LLM to be able to go and navigate through that. If it has some kind of taxonomy or some sort of understanding of like, what is the organization of this content and how should I think about it? And where should I go for the most updated information about, my product or my policies? That's sort of the way that we think about building a future where agents are able to go and like correctly navigate and manage context on their own. It's really about that like augmentation of content with like the right kind of metadata.
Yep. And default state of most organizations is PDFs are static. They're
Yep.
stuck in systems. So there is like some preparation and readiness work that needs to be done in order to transform from that state, current state, to a state where context is flexibly available and transformed for the purposes of really having like more predictable agents in the flow. And I think I'm excited to see organizations kind of approaching that state. So I guess my last question for you is once organizations are in a state where they have a learning engine deployed throughout the enterprise, where agents can tap into data that's constantly being improved and standardized and structured, so you have a complete view of your entire like organizational structure and all the policies, procedures that are used to drive the organization, the voice of the agents and the transcripts coming in to basically understand how to improve them across every workflow. What happens after that? What is the future out of all this? What is the potential of where this is going?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is no one knows, right? Like that is the short and honest answer. I imagine a future where, a lot of people today are familiar with like, again, Claude AI and ChatGPT. You spend some time on these and they're pretty helpful, right? Out of the box, they know a lot. They're pretty smart. If you give them like the right tools, they can go and sort of traverse your email. They can go over Slack. I imagine that, but sort of 10x, right? So I imagine that LLMs will be really good at understanding what information they have access to. They will be really good at understanding, given your organization's context, where would I go given some request? If I may be asking about some new product feature, but the LLM will know, given the context of my organization, that I have to go into like XYZ tool and look at the latest sprint or whatever it is. So I think about really like 10xing the experience today, where it feels like it's always on. It feels like it has perfect visibility into the organization. Under the hood, there will be a very smart model that is highly capable, but I imagine like much broader scopes of information available to the agent and much more ability to decipher what is high signal.
Amazing. I was at a dinner with Constantine from Sequoia the other day, and he puts it really, really well, right? Like we're entering an era where, you can gain maximum leverage, but you have to deal with the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And, the conversation that we had over dinner was like, if you can reduce the uncertainty, there's no limit to the amount of leverage you can get. And that's like an organization of the future where you're right. No one really knows what that looks like. But it opens up a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so the importance of having evals, well-defined evals across all the agents in your enterprise, sometimes multi-agents that are interacting via protocols, MCP, A to A, right? It's hugely valuable in terms of reducing uncertainty and ensuring that leverage increases in the organization. And I mean, the final note on this, do you see organizations reaching a point of maximum leverage and like no limit to that? Or is it still an uncertain environment?
Yeah, I think in short, yes, like we will absolutely get to a point where we are able to like maximize leverage for organizations, right? The path to get there may be rocky, may be complicated. There are lots of problems we have to go solve. We have to keep making good models. We have to keep making, models that operate over much larger context windows with much higher fidelity. But yes, I think we will get there.
Amazing. Love to end on that note. Ethan, thank you so much for taking the time. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Saroop.